Has Rachel Reeves' speech outlining all the terrible problems that lie ahead freaked the markets, freaked the public, or calmed anybody ahead of her budget? And is it totally unfair, and it is, that Reform's economic strategies are falling off the edge at a rate of knots, with the Kent County Council that they run actually increasing, it looks, council taxes rather than managing to save money? But nobody seems to notice that kind of thing. Anyway, we look at all of that. We discussed the land reform legislation that was going through Holyrood last week, which seems very destined to make no difference whatsoever except complicate life considerably. We look at various things from the Edinburgh trams to the likelihood that a really productive and to Trump's mind disturbing communist will win the New York mayor's election later today. Trump's threatening to cut off all extra cash to New York City. So all of that and more in the podcast. Those are the headlines. Now for the podcast.
Well, hi folks, and welcome to this week's Lesley British podcast. Lesley, are you still surviving? You're in wonderful Paris, I think, at the moment. Are you in Brussels now, or are you just stuck in a train station under a blanket?
No, although last night it was a sobering thing. I'm in Brussels for a meeting that I'm speaking at of stateless nations. There's a meeting organised by a sort of branch of the EU that's or a lobby group within it that's got MSPs coming to sort of see how stateless nations are dealing with the threat of the far right. So I had a bit of a rock and roll journey, it would have to be said. But actually, just to cut to the chase, I'm sitting in a lovely hotel room, when you finally get here, out of which I could see a homeless person spending the night in a doorway of a very chic-looking office block, all tidied away by the time, the people came this morning at 8 a.m. And I mean, I'm feeling a bit, you're the same, we've both got wee coughs, my foot is still killing me. It was a terrible journey. You feel very sorry for yourself. And then you look at somebody, you think, where did they even go? If they have health problems, who gives a toss? It's just, yes, so that was a bit of a kind of leveler, but it wasn't a great journey. It did start off in Glasgow. I was taking a plane to Paris, as advised, the best way to get here, weirdly, because the Eurostar is so fast. To get to Paris, Charles de Gaulle, then get the Eurostar, then get to Brussels. It's all fine until it isn't, apart from the plane arriving late. It seems to be the standard these days. But there was a family with a kid that had chicken pox on board. And I think this was visible enough for the crew to be a little alarmed and actually said, you can't really travel with them like that, which, you might think is a bit late now, because we were all packed in like sardines around them. And they really were very resistant to kind of getting off. But the crew were very, a very French kind of professional, polite way of sort of saying there is just no way the regulations state, blah, blah. So finally they get them off. And then they had to get their luggage out of the hold. So that took another hour long. Then we missed the slot. Then we got to Paris. Then I missed the train. And then there's the next thing. We could just basically using the same ticket anywhere. Ooh, not here. So, you miss the train and that's you, 60 quid gone. And you've just, buy another ticket completely. The lassie that was helping me, I was just getting so petted lip about it, said, but your airplane will connect this, will allow you to refund. And I said, it was EasyJet. She went, oh, okay.
Okay, no, you're stuffed.
She was getting all off. I thought it was, she was basically going to say a proper airline, like Air France. So anyway, zut alors, at least I've managed to use my French a couple of times this morning, pain au chocolat. Merci. So we'll see how the thing goes today anyway. And it'll be nice to see all the other folk. There's a lot of folk from the Basque countries coming, as a lassie from Northern Ireland, I think. So yeah, it'll be good crack.
Jolly good. I too have been on a train journey, not anything like as exotic as yours. I almost started this with the public service announcement now that it's autumn for you to check your posh wool coat for tacking stitches at the bottom of the split. Because, oh my God, walking through stations, we're seeing all these people wandering around with all the little tacking stitches still in the back of their fancy coats and just want to tap them on the shoulder and say, did you know? And you've also got pockets as well. Just
Right.
one of my
You might just
weird
have to.
things.
It is one of your very weird things. And in fact, just since you have begun this one, I don't know whether this is apocryphal or true that you did actually get small cards made to slip into people's pockets.
Well, you know how Scottish people like to, speak to people in a way that other folk don't. If you're on the Glasgow Underground, you don't have to just sort of stare at your feet. You can go, hi, where did you get that, such and such. So yes, I do have a small card that I sometimes hand off to people to tell them to take the tacking stitches out of their coat. Young guys particularly are mesmerised and totally amazed by the fact that all of my posh coats have got pockets. I'm like, yes, my friend, and your blazers and anything else you've got. And it's quite the revelation for them, because if you don't know, you don't know. I hasten to add, I don't stop women with tacking stitches still in the backs of their skirts, because that is very much not to be done. But you do see people waddling around, and you think, if you only but knew that actually isn't supposed to be there, you'd be like, this is so much more comfortable now that I've discovered the ways.
Tacking stitches, that's going to be a new one for everyone today. And actually, you've now probably set off a whole load of, folk with Virgo rising prowling the streets looking for tacking stitch victims, But anyway, but it does show you I've got a friend who's rented out a place to a tailor who looks like he's going to have to just shut up shop because nobody buys suits anymore, he says. So, your tailor, your tacking stitch problem might be eradicating itself.
On the way. But
anyway,
people have still got posh coats. But yes, I fully agree. And certainly since it's now into the autumn, there's a whole load of folk wandering about with wool coats with bits still stuck to the back of them. Anywho.
Well, thank you for that, Fraser. I mean, seriously, there'll be people I'm sure there'll be people going, seriously, how can anyone be so stupid? And others thinking, oh my God.
Yeah, you go up any escalator in the land at this time of the year and you go, oh, look, there's another one.
Mm-hmm. Right,
anyway,
stop.
Chickenpox, I think, is only contagious until all your scabs have crusted up. So if you could have seen it, I think you'd have been fine for travel. But I'd imagine arguing that with EasyJet's probably not for the best. And I dare say if you were pregnant or anything else, you'd be quite happy that the chickenpox infected case number 0 got taken off the plane before all the air gets circulated around you for an hour and what have you.
Well, anyway, that was just the kind of version that was given to us, so dear knows that was just very intense discussions. But it is interesting watching everybody of a public functionary nature, and a fonctionnaire, I think sort of is almost a French word, but everywhere you go, the stations you're hanging around in, the lassie kind of helped me with something that wasn't working in the room. Everybody it's like all the French drama that you watch. Everyone has got their position, Monsieur le Docteur, all the Monsieur le Juge, all this kind of stuff. And it's exactly like that. People are, the woman who clipped the ticket, bon voyage, madame, and all this stuff.
Yes.
There's something still very sort of formal, and it's kind of not the freezing formality that we do, because it's almost like we did a blooming revolution to get this state, so actually we're quite proud of the roles we've got in it, and it's, we're holding them. So, yeah. Anyway, so.
Jolly good. Well, the Chancellor's been out and about this morning with doom and gloom, warning everybody that we've got the highest borrowing costs of the G7, which we already knew in the independence movement, and that Britain is somewhat screwed, and she wants to probably put up taxes, but she's not going to reveal that until her December budget. But this is part of the kind of long lead-in, kind of ramping up, I think, concerns about tax rises, so that when they come, they seem slightly less big and less scary than they actually are.
Indeed. And I sort of watched her on BBC One, which is curiously here. And I don't know how this is going to wash with people, because she gave a long explanation. I mean, I must admit, I wasn't kind of completely focused on it. But then, see, that's me with numbers. As soon as they pitch in, I sort of find my attention wanders. And I think I might be a bit like Josephine Average on that one. So the description of how, the borrowing costs and the international borrowing costs and the fact that we need to get them down because other economies were more attractive. Do you think? I mean, come on, yeah. I mean, just by the by, that I can't remember who I was listening to talking about investment in energy resources, which is looking sort of shaky in all regards. And somebody had noted that there'd been something like 8 changes of policy on the oil and gas regime in the last, 5 years. And see, like that's, if you want to talk just about what attracts people. If you look at the Danes, they've had the same general policy about the opposite, about moving away from oil and gas for about 50 years. So if you wanted to invest in renewables, you think, we think of Britain that's a bit kind of flaky and it might be on, it might be off or whatever. Or there's the Danes, 50 years. That's a pretty solid commitment. They're not going to move the goalposts. But anyway, I digress. So she didn't kind of wow me, I've got to say. And I would have thought she'd worried people a hell of a lot because it just looks gloomy as hell. And now everybody expects from Labour that they have come out, with cheery bunny stuff. And then when you're not, not expecting it, there's a basic punch in the gullet.
Yeah. And one of the things it did underscore is that the markets are no more convinced by her than they were by the outgoing Conservative government. And she's done very little to put confidence into the economy or into the people watching the markets to bring these borrowing costs down. So borrowing costs are a reflection of the fact that you're flaky and that you're not a good bet and that there are better places to stick your money. So she as Chancellor in the incoming Labour government did not hail a kind of reset in the economic landscape, and this speech today seemed to be very much about doom and gloom, just to underscore to people how screwed things were. So when they come to break their manifesto promises, and also break, as they were pointing out in the questions afterwards, but wasn't last year's budget the budget where you said this is the sort of biggest tax expansion and this is going to be it for the Parliament, but we have to do this because ... And now you're coming back to saying actually the ... have got bigger, and so the tax rises. It is all part of this kind of pitch rolling for the budget, so I think it means that the budget's going to be even gloomier, with one or two rabbits pulled out of hats, no doubt, to try and kind of generate some headlines. But it doesn't look like plain sailing for the UK government, and it doesn't look like Rachel Reeves is really kind of instilling confidence in the markets and able to right things. I'm
not sure how much she's sort of, it's working with the public. I mean, there is the speculation that she wants to cut tax, I mean, it's VAT on energy bills and maybe scrap the 2-child benefit cap. But if there's anything about breaking the promises on tax rises, there's not going to be any attention paid to that. It's going to be hard to feel sunny. And this is what seems to be a characteristic of Labour stuff. It's funny how once you're just on a roll, you're on a roll. And once you're on the opposite, it's really hard to kind of break the feeling that you're just basically a gloomster, and that does kind of come across pretty strongly, even though I see people like the Resolution Foundation, the Guardian reports it, that actually there could be a better situation by the time we get to the budget, 22 days time just, that there's a couple of things that have gone a stronger pay outlook, whatever that means, could offset a lot of the pain of lower productivity. But she wants to kind of get a bit of more fiscal headroom, so she might still try to, claw back a bit more cash. So whatever. The other thing that struck me today was that that Reform have been out and about, kind of talking, trying to look like they could be a government in waiting, which, I think pretty much everybody is kind of, if you want to protest, vote, just knock yourselves out. But if you want to kind of get to anything that isn't going to be Liz Truss on steroids. So Richard Tice apparently a couple of days ago had said that that Reform was thinking of sweeping changes to public sector pensions. Now, it's a funny one, that, because the pensions thing keeps rearing its head with regard to, Scottish independence, like there's the big scary one that's never been sorted. Well, if these guys have got a chance of getting in, there's, their deputy saying, how long can we carry on offering defined benefit pensions to public sector workers? And if you look online and social media and stuff, every different group has decided that means them, from firefighters to NHS staff to, there's a lot of people sitting in that basket.
Yeah.
So, I don't know how they managed to get away with that. You blink and you miss that, and you blink and you miss Farage, who's also backtracking on previous, tax commitments.
Well, I mean, this is them kind of all over the place all of the time. And I think that's one of the problems with the reformist types is that, it's all things to all people. It's big, bold policies, and then, but we didn't really mean X and Y, because we've now discovered that that doesn't pull very well. And we're shifting around. And I suppose Rachel Reeves is trying to be out there being, look at me, I'm just an honest guy, telling it like it is. I'm not sweeping things out. She must have said that 3 or 4 times. I'm not sweeping things under the carpet, and I'm not just going to cut capital budgets because there's drive growth in order to sort of trim the budget and get things back on track. She's a bit of a to do as well with her property rental, which did seem like a bit of a kind of, I don't know, storm in a teacup. But what struck me really, rather than the fact that she forgot to fill in this form, or they thought that the letting agent was filling in this form on her behalf, you don't actually have to rent out your house once you get a free one. Immediately move into number 11 Downing Street and have a grace and favour property, and the first thing you think is, well, I'm not earning enough as Chancellor. I better put my own property on the market and rent it out so we can top up our income. I think you might want to kind of escape from 11 Downing Street at the weekend and just go back to your real house, where you know where things are, and you've got the comfy sofa, and just batten down the hatches, rather than try and flog it for whatever it was, $3,000 a month or something. That to me was a more kind of pertinent part of the story, and didn't seem to get covered at all.
Yeah, I wonder if people have. Well, because obviously it brings Angela Rayner to mind so completely. And as I thought at the time, I mean, okay, there was all the stuff. She was the housing minister and didn't understand her own stamp duty stuff or whatever. But it was more the thing that here was this sort of, to them, northern lass, obviously not northern enough. But still, she's from the Manchester area. But she'd chosen to basically buy this house in Hove on the Sussex coast, which just seemed again like kind of, when I'm really left to my own devices, do I want to spend time with my constituents really? Do I want to, or do I just want to get my tootsies in the southern seas and kind of, go for a swim in the morning?
Yeah, get the Prosecco sorted.
And it's sort of like, it's not a crime. I mean, this sounds as miserable as Scots are painted as being. Perhaps it is just miserable. But I think it's these things that don't get said, the sort of wee pernickety bits about the regulations they've flouted is one thing, but it's kind of more the sort of snub to the person that you thought they were, or that they've projected as being. But still, back to cheery old reform though, because I notice there's the Doge chief of reform has apparently given up trying to get data from Kent County Council, which, as you may know, is run by reform. And so there was this pledge, when we're back to these pledges of stuff. Reform won in the May elections with promises to bring down council tax by cutting wasteful spending. But they're discovering that they can't actually manage to do it in Kent, so that the Times have done a big expose on this, and they think that more than 2 million homes in reform-run councils, Kent and others, will face tax rises of, putting it together, £127 million next year. Sweet. Yeah. And just on the top of it, apparently Kent Council has also ruled that St George's flags have to be removed so that traditional Christmas lights can be put up instead due to safety concerns.
In case the LED lights set the flags on fire.
Which a Green councillor called the move beyond ironic. So, this is me just getting limbered up for my far right gig, But anyway.
Definitely. Well, I hope it is Christmas and not winter festivals or what the kind of usual things that reformist types go berserk about, not calling it a Christmas festival. So, yeah. And also we've seen some defections from reform to the Conservatives.
Really?
At council level, there was one councillor who just decided that beyond reform policies were beyond the pale. And as I predicted last week, we saw that those people who had defected from the Greens to the putative Your Party put together a public letter decrying the inclusion of UCare and Craig Murray my wife always says that if I ever have a stroke and get dysphasia, she'll never be able to tell the difference. So apologies for the gap there, Craig Murray, suggesting that they had left the quotes toxic Alba in their view, and that really they were not the type of people that should be in your party. So a lot still to be resolved there in terms of, what your party stands for and, how it's going to shake out.
Yeah, but
So
actually
moves backwards and forward.
something we might miss otherwise. I wrote a column about this a while ago. Is what might be sort of good news in New York City today. In fact, even as we speak, because the sort of pretty kind of charismatic lefty Zoran Mamdani, who everybody thought had not a chance. This is the guy that wants to have a kind of nationalised grocer shops chains so that people can actually afford food in the city. Spends all his time walking across the city in the middle of the night speaking to Abadi, basically. Anyway, he looks like he's got a very good chance of winning, which is a sort of complete shift to where the Democrats would be if that happens. He's up against the incumbent whose name has just leapt out of my head, Cuomo.
Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah, who has kind of got quite a lot of, a bit sleazy kind of stuff associated with him. And so it looks like a 10% lead for a real clean sweep in New York City. So into the midst of this comes Donald Trump, of course, who has just issued this warning. If communist candidate, there he is, Zoran Mamdani wins the election for mayor of New York City, it is highly unlikely I will contribute federal funds other than the minimum required to my beloved first home. I don't want to send, as president, good money after bad. So there he is. He's threatening to kind of basically cut the cash in New York City on the eve of voting to try. And he's backing Cuomo, who is a Democrat, I think, just, old guard Democrat.
Yeah. So if we remember, we picked up a little while ago on the huge upset of the Democratic primary where Cuomo was defeated by Mamdani. But, this is incredible stuff.
It is incredible. So anyway, Mamdani has come back out sort of saying, let's address that threat for what it is. It's a threat. It is not the law. Too often we treat everything coming out of Trump's mouth as if it is already legal just by virtue of who is saying it. So it'll be interesting to see if this last minute stuff makes any difference to it. And if it doesn't, that really is quite astonishing. I mean, Cuomo has said, he was saying on Fox News, and, that tells you probably all you need to know, but we need a mayor, that's himself, who can stand up to Donald Trump. This is after Trump comes on and endorses him. He's talking about Trump threatening to stop funding the city and potentially sending in the National Guard, as they did to, was it Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, the National Guard being deployed all over the place.
Yes.
And this is,
But he's, so Cuomo's saying Trump will go through Mamdani like a hot knife through butter. And that's the guy on the same side as you. That's a Democrat. So I just think we should all have a wee look for that, because we'll probably get, don't watch BBC News for anything. But, I mean, it'll be an interesting analysis probably on Channel 4. But there's a lot riding on that. And there's two other gubernatorial governing kind of ships up today, which could also go the Democrats' way, which would be an interesting thing, albeit, it's the centre of the storm when you've got this level of threat against a democratic decision.
And, we're still talking about David Cameron putting the Queen up to interfering in the independence referendum with, people should think very carefully. It sort of puts that into the shade where you're basically having a gun to your head saying, if you don't vote for my guy or the guy that I think is the more palatable, we're going to defund you and send in the army.
Absolutely. And just while we're at that, so Andy is, what is he now?
Well, it's Mr. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, or Saxe Coburn Gotha, if you want to be obnoxious about it, having been removed from the role of peers and having, I think, a new royal warrant issued stripping him of his status as prince. So this
is that enough? Because, I mean, with all of this, I mean, that has actually stripped him of the title, so it's now not his choice what he uses, is it? It's just gone.
Yeah. And
he's out of his he's out of his mansion and into some other sort of cottage that is also a mansion.
Yes. They have a lot of mansions called cottages, seems to be one of the major takeaways that you can get. One or two things you could unpack from this. They could have done that initially. This does seem to be a kind of ramping up after having felt the public backlash against him being able to put out his own statements, and what I was saying last week about being fired versus resigning. And the fact that he was still very much able to, this is my decision in consultation with the king. I'm sort of stepping aside from these titles and not using them. He has been stripped of prince, so a kind of actual action has been taken to remove him from being a prince, because being a prince is governed by a letters patent, which says that all the sons of sovereigns or sons of sovereigns or children of sons of sovereigns become automatically prince or princess. So something had to be done to have that taken off. Removing him from the role of peers was a cute one, and I think that must have been after a lot of legal head scratching and how can we do this. So the initial suggestion, of course, was that there would have to be an act of parliament, because the king doesn't have a prerogative power to strip people of a life peerage. And they thought that they would have to go down the same route as they did in the 30s 1919 to remove those German princes from their British titles after World War One. They haven't made it go away, so they've taken it off the role of peers, which means that it kind of isn't to be referred to, but the peerage itself isn't extinct. It's not become available again, so they couldn't give it to somebody else, for example. So it's a kind of ramping up of the just putting it beyond use as opposed to really, really taking it off you. Why do we care about that? I think the only interesting thing about that, or the interesting thing about that, is that they're obviously desperate not to have the matter debated in Parliament. And the moment you put an Act of Parliament up, even if it was very tightly drafted just to do this one specific thing, I think there would have been a kind of opening of the floodgates in terms of being able to properly discuss the monarchy. And I think it would have been highly likely that there would have been amendments to tack on potentially some kind of royal commission or other type of investigation, perhaps a new committee of the Commons to look into his role as trade envoy and all of the dodgy stuff that had gone on and the corruption and the sort of other payments that he'd had or the business dealings that he'd tacked into his role, his public role and his publicly funded role as UK trade ambassador.
So does it look like because that was a Stephen Flynn one amongst others pushing that? Does that look like it's dead in the water then now, or it was dead in the water because Lindsay Hoyle, you sent me a message. You were feeling Lindsay Hoyle saying, there's no way we're going to have this debate.
Oh, that was a typical Lindsay Hoyle.
That's the speaker, I should say.
Yes. Norton previously as a Tory lickspittle, now a Labour lickspittle. He was a member of the Labour Party, but was very kind to the previous Conservative government to keep his position. He basically said that there was no members were not prevented from having a debate title specifically looking at a member of the royal family, but they were prevented from raising matters to do with the royal family at question. So you could only debate matters around the royal family on a kind of specific motion. You couldn't just tack it into other things, business questions or questions about trade, for example. And that people were entitled to have that motion, but he'd not selected the motion and there wasn't time to debate it at the moment. It's just kind of like, I'm not saying it's against the rules, it's just not going to happen any time on my watch, which is just completely nuts. So I think it was really, they were desperate to keep it off the floor of the House and desperate to avoid anything else being kind of shoehorned in, I think there would have been a huge amount of pressure on MPs from external groups to add extra things into that bill. And even if the government ultimately had the votes to defeat that, that would have been very embellishing for both the Parliament and for the Labour government, which all throughout this have been a kind of, this is a matter for the king and it's not something that we want to get into.
Well, I don't know if this is skipping along wrongly, but I'm sort of thinking also really an embarrassment, it should be, was sort of the land reform debate last week. I mean, it was hard to kind of follow that. There's so much else happening. So, of course, when you're not quite sure what's going on, you just have a look on Andy Whiteman's page, and his conclusion is, I have argued that it would be irresponsible of Parliament to impose the new complex legalistic bureaucratic mechanisms on the people of Scotland in this bill, which will not deliver the outcomes ministers say they will. They are just making bad law. Nothing has transpired since that causes me to change my mind. So that's basically it in a nutshell. It is the bill is introducing incredibly complex procedures about transferring ownership of any part of a large landholding over 1,000 hectares. I could go into the details of all of this, but I think your brains would start to glaze over, and I'm going to put the link into Andy's explainer so you can, knock yourselves out if you really want to know more about that. But it also, these kind of interventions only happen when they're triggered by somebody registering land late and lotting it, sort of dividing it up in ways. And that seems a kind of thing that is rarely done, such that this is not going to be the thing that changes a situation, which Andy's calculations also reveal has actually got worse over time, so that we have now got fewer people owning big bits of land than there were in 1872. Some of that is because of large community buyouts, to be fair, on the Western Isles. A tiny bit, tiny bit. But he's also done the maths to show that people who already had a bit of land are getting another bit of non-contiguous land. I mean, they're just sort of sweeping up. And again, a failing of the legislation, which was pointed to, could have been corrected, and the Scottish Government knocked it back, was to talk about non-contiguous bits of land. Like, I could be the Duke of Buccleuch with kind of branches almost everywhere, but if I haven't got one bit that's over 1,000 acres, I jump straight through the legislation scot-free. I sort of paraphrase roughly for effect. So, I mean, there's a lot of detail in all of this. There were loads of amendments. And it's hard to keep track of all of them. But there was one I mentioned before regarding poor old Burnt Island, whose people just want to walk. I mean, God, just want to walk around the harbour as what they have done for probably centuries. And because this is the key to all the problems about the land reform legislation we've got, is that if you have a landowner who just won't play ball, you suddenly get legislation that cannot seem to force action. The council could have got into the enforcement business. It appears they didn't want to do it when Fourth Port's put up a fence stopping people getting in, because Fourth Port's got deep pockets, would have been litigious. Don't think we're going to go there. So what the local MSPs have done, and this is all MSPs of all parties have got together on this, Claire Baker from the Labour, Mark Ruskell Green, David Torrance is leading the show for the SNP. Everybody's agreed about this. They want an amendment that just specifically names Burnt Island and requires Fourth Ports to give access to the public. But it seems the Scottish Government are kind of just nervous about all of this, and it looks like there's sort of legal problems as to just some of the phrases in it, whether there's a change needed from saying that the Scottish Government must, or rather the Fourth Ports must immediately act, may apparently would be better in terms of the legislation. That, I think, was how it was drafted, and the change was made at the suggestion of the legislative framers in the Scottish Parliament. So it's like, these guys just want to walk. They've already had to get their brains around all sorts of complex stuff to be able to get this far. They're totally determined to keep going. And there could be a wheeze later today, and I don't understand this at all, but you, with your, past with Joanna, might see this, that the request that looks like it's being denied from David Torrance, he could withdraw his motion. That could then be objected to by another MSP like Claire Baker, and that could then go to a vote for the amendment, and everyone but the SNP will vote for it. And if there's not a lot of folk in the chamber, it could work.
Yeah.
Is that roughly what
I think so?
Get around things.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that the core thing here, and you rightly pointed out that we're not hearing very much about this. Why are we not hearing very much about this? It's actually quite, core to a lot of people's belief about the problems of Scotland. And the fact that despite all this land legislation going through in the past 20 years, the concentration of land ownership is not getting any better. And then, as you said, in some regards, getting worse. If you'd introduced a smoking ban and more people took up smoking, or you introduced minimum pricing on alcohol and it had the opposite effect, you would really be sitting down to say, what do we want here? And it's not very obvious from the Scottish Government what their policy aims are. There's a lot of rhetoric about reducing the concentration of land ownership and making land ownership more fair and equal, and that will surely have an important contribution to both local communities at a community level and a kind of business and development level. There's lots of people just hoarding onto things and refusing to let them go. This legislation doesn't do that.
But neither did any of the previous ones.
No.
It's
so what is the point? And it's the Andy Whiteman briefing is great, which we're going to link to. He says, but if you take nothing away from this, take this. This bill will do nothing to reduce or have any influence on the pattern of ownership, whether concentrated or otherwise, of private land ownership in Scotland. Whatsoever. Yeah. I could add myself. So, this is just taking up parliamentary time, shushling a whole load of things around, but doesn't actually tackle the root of the problem. And that, in some respects, is my kind of central premise of why reform seem a bit sexy to certain people, because they're just like, no, stuff it, we're doing X, and that's what's happening. It doesn't matter how crackpot it is, it's going to happen. The same with Trump. You didn't want to stop, doing some policy that I disagreed with. Well, we're just unfunding you, and it's been double cancelled. We need to see we keep calling for bold land reform action, and we keep getting lengthy bills with clauses in it that nobody can use, or that so through holes in terms of, we're looking at rapture persecution the other month, that, it doesn't work.
Yeah. And actually, as the coup de grace on this one is Andy has actually sent a joint letter with a guy, Don McLeod, who's the head of land and property at Turk and Connell. So these are, the legit land agents. And they're basically saying that the bill is flawed in its construction. There's a problem about the definition of large landholdings, the people who should be notified about land sales, the possible discrimination of late registration provisions, the conflict of interest of Scottish ministers. It's strange, actually, because it's the sort of pattern you'd expect from Scottish landed estates who just think, that any change to land ownership is a Mugabe-style land raid. I paraphrase roughly. I'm sure some of them are more reasonable. But, when you've got somebody of Andy's experience and vintage, kind of weighing in saying this actually is just riven with legal problems, never mind anything else. And of course, people remember Andy was an MSP and has got a mind like a blooming forensic ferret for 4 years. So, it looks very likely that the stuff the Tories are coming away with, which is that there'll be loads of legal challenge over this, is very possibly true. And meanwhile, back at the fort, for what? This is what's so depressing about the whole thing, because previous bits of legislation, I'm thinking it's the Crofting Community Right to Buy 2003. I don't know if the people on Great Burner and Lewis are still trying to use that, but if they are, this is 10 years they've been trying to do that. And it hinges upon mapping the area to the agreement or satisfaction of the landowner to start using the mechanisms. If you get a fence post wrong, they just knock it back and say that the mapping's wrong. And you have to guess. Of course, they won't tell you exactly what it is that's wrong. So you go over and over and over and over it, and time drags on. They don't say no, that they're not willing to do a sale or a transfer. They just don't do it. So, you can go on like this for ages, and that is all implicit in the way all these bills, it seems to me, have been constructed, leaving people, the Burnt Island folk, having to do this blimmin' slow shoe shuffle today of this weird kind of axing the bill so that someone else can pick it up stuffy to try and get the thing through. I should say, just by the by, in case anybody legal is indeed listening, the thing that the Scottish ministers seem worried about with the Burnt Island Harbour Amendment is calling it a place of public resort. The Scottish ministers say this isn't a legally defined term. The Burnt Island folk have got 2 professors, one of whom's written a book about this, who has got submitted 11 pages discussing this exact wording in the leading legal textbook of which he is a co-author, which has been in print for 27 years. But no. So it's kind of, maybe it's just that when you've got a specific interest in stuff like this, you see what must be the sort of daily absurdity of much legislation. I mean, what was that phrase about you never want to see sausages or laws being made, But, and to many people who are kind enough to observe that, perhaps I should have been kind of, going for a Holyrood. No. I mean, it blows my gasket to just read about this from other people, but to be sitting in the middle of this, spending your life doing this, when there's just so much bigger fish to fry and problems that you came into politics for. Anyway, it must be pretty crushing, but it is exactly what makes people start to move towards simpler, swinging solutions, Gordian knot type solutions of just slicing through all that. All that is government, I have to say, government-made confusion and complexity to just say, we need, I mean, that's where Mercedes Villalba from Labour said, we just need a maximum acreage, the end. Or we need a land tax, which could be done. And of course, this cues up your other beef about council tax.
Well, this is council tax. The Scottish Government, or the SNP's party's manifesto, page 82, 2021 manifesto said, we'll ask a citizens' assembly to consider the way forward on council tax reform alongside the questions of wider powers for local government. It is just about the end of the current session of Parliament. They're going to have an election in May, so we've got, less than 6 months, or just a bit over 6 months to go. And as we said last week, there's a new consultation out on council tax reform, which seems to simply be proposing adding a few extra bands on to make more expensive properties marginally higher in council tax, but doing nothing about the fact that it's all based on property prices from the 1990s and that it doesn't reflect your ability to pay or the value of your property accurately. And instead of actually having a Gordian knot for democracy solution, which is to put things to a citizens' assembly in the way that contentious things were done in Ireland, like the reform of abortion in the Irish constitution,
yeah.
Really big, difficult things that people have been agonizing over for decades. I mean, we have been promising to reform the council tax since 2007, are not happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're just kind of whacking out a kind of standard consultation in the sort of dying days of the Parliament. That consultation is not going to give you the kind of the backing and the chutzpah to put something, dramatic into your manifesto for 2026. So it's not leading up to anything bigger. It's just diminishing the original ask.
But the thing is, if people will always ask me, I did a very jolly event at the Robert Burns Centre in Alloway on Sunday, and people were coming up as usual and sort of saying, why is the SNP just not doing some decent land reform? What is the actual problem? And I mean, I just don't know. Do they think it just, in the great scheme of things, they'll make a lot of enemies. It doesn't really matter. There's only a little rump of people that are really bothered about it. It's one of these virtue signalling things where everyone sort of says they get a bit hot and bothered, but actually nobody really gives a toss, because if they did, they would have done something politically about it, is my surmise, But then, is it just that lawyers run the Scottish government? Is it that on so many things you see a kind of legal worry about something cited? Is that an excuse? Or is it the truth that people who are not very sure about where they stand on legislation defer hugely to lawyers who are innately conservative and worry massively about change? Or have we got a Scottish Parliament that is not actually capable of taking big decisions like this? Or an SNP that isn't. I mean, you do wonder about all the above, and then after a while you stop wondering and you don't bother, you don't turn out to vote. I mean, it needs something. But actually, just on the end of the rant, when you were saying, why don't we know about some of this stuff, this was something I was kind of writing about last week in the National, about Good Morning Scotland being pronounced deed. And yet, not very much about GMS seems to be changing, except the two main presenters. And I was kind of, it'll be called Breakfast. It's still going, broadcast from 6 to 9 a.m. And I noticed that in the blurb, it talks excitedly about Phil Goodlad presenting the sports news. He's been doing that for about a decade, Phil. He's a great broadcaster, Phil, a Shetlander, and a really funny, kind of skilled guy. So there isn't anything that's changing except the thing that needs to change, which is the editorial mission. Because in all these years of 52 years or something like that of Good Morning Scotland, Scotland has changed profoundly. So we're now in a situation where, half the population, at least, generally a bit more than that, supports independence. And you must assume that there's probably a few bit more that, are kind of open to the idea. And yet, the sort of agenda you get of what's covered within Good Morning Scotland, it acts as if that constituency doesn't exist. And I mean, we talked last week, I'm not going to go on about it, about Caerphilly, but GMS, like everybody else, just didn't put it. Well, in fact, the Today programme did have coverage of that by-election in its main slot at 10 minutes past 8. It's just that it decided to, discuss it amongst itself, not to put the actual victors on. But Radio Scotland didn't even do that. They basically had political editors on from BBC Wales and the BBC News, Chris Mason, who started his interview with, "There's pride for Plaid, but principally this is a story about Labour." Pride. Well, just that's fine. That was on Radio Scotland. Just would anybody in the editorial team there think that if there's half the population are keen on independence for Scotland, they might quite like to hear from the Welsh guys who want independence for Wales? But that just isn't there. And it would be, if that was in your mind, that constituency had to be dealt with. Same with it's not all kind of, cozying up to the SNP as well. It would be that question of land reform. I mean, I don't remember, and I wasn't listening forensically, I'll grant you, but I did listen right through to a couple of GMSs. There was no discussion about what's happening in the land reform bill. And I mean, it's important. And I remember back in the day when I was doing it, a lot of stuff that's important isn't interesting. And so it's quite hard to you've really got to pull the stops out, but that's what you get paid for. And there's ways to kind of G that up a wee bit. I did suggest if they put the aforementioned Andy Whiteman, or indeed Max Wisniewski, who runs Revive Scotland, who did the big research that suggests everybody wants land reform change, put one of those guys up against somebody that thinks, land reform is a Mugabe-style land raid. I think you'd find a lot of people sitting still in their cars listening to that. But it's not going to happen. And we're not going to get a probe or a look at how, Scotland could have a republic, because obviously that's totally favouring the independence and frothing masses, despite the fact opinion polls are now hugely in favour of dumping the monarch as head of state. So all these things that are actually polling is showing that the Scottish population is like. is ignored in the output, which is just terrified to venture anywhere into that sort of area. And the kind of people who are on, I actually did text Robin McAlpine because I've never heard him on there. And he came back and said he'd been on GMS 3 times in his entire life. Now, Fraser Valander get on a wee bit more than that. So there's plenty for GMS to be thinking about, and guaranteed it will not happen. And then what? That's why people listen to this podcast, I'm imagining,
I think so. Absolutely. And thank you for doing so. And big thanks to all of our subscribers, our pals and chums for supporting the podcast. But, the core problem you're identifying there is it doesn't sound like it comes from Scotland. It might have Scottish presenters on it, but it sounds like, I think you normally, was it Rip and Read that you talk about?
Yeah.
It's just kind of, here's the email from the BBC newsroom in London, and this is today's running order, and this is how we're kind of, put a bit of a kilt on it, and scot it up, as opposed to sitting at 5 o'clock in the morning thinking, right, what are the big stories for us today, and how are we going to cover them?
Or even, here's a big story coming on Rip and Read, but here's what's really big for us, because we've got a big, there's a big interest in that question about a republic, or there's a big interest in land reform. So anything else that might be small somewhere else. I mean, this is to paraphrase and reverse James Robertson's fabulous poem, the news where you are. Well, the news where they are is not necessarily news where we are. We have to get to a stage where the stuff that affects this country, that goes straight in, whether it comes off Rip and Read or not, and it's difficult because there's a right rake of stuff going on all the time. And since any kind of survey will show that the majority of people care about the NHS, schools, and this sort of stuff top, if you get a story in about health or education, you're going to feel honour bound the same way everybody else does to put that top. But if you aren't searching beneath it for why the problems exist, many of them, just to take one small one, the problems in a lot of the rural Scotland about the NHS, I can think of Skye in particular, that they can't actually get staff to staff the new hospital there because there's nowhere for them to live, which comes back to the problem of land scarcity. So it's kind of like you can keep, as Alan Sinclair, who is very learned about all this stuff, once said, Scotland has become a nation of ambulance chasers. We go to the scene of accidents, not the cause.
Yeah.
So you can do that in journalism, broadcasting, and anything else. Keep going to the scene of the accident. And actually, the scene of the accident's not bad in the sense that it directs attention, is why you might want to discuss this today as opposed to last week, next month. But, rapidly it needs to turn into something that's more of an exposition. And I mean, to be fair, some presenters are very capable of doing that. But just day in, day out, this is still not anything where you expect, when I quoted Clive Myrie, the London news anchor, who pops up in those adverts, sort of saying, this is your BBC, which is usually enough for me if I've accidentally gone onto that channel to switch over, actually, because it just so isn't.
This is our BBC and you're paying for it.
Anyway,
speaking of councils, not council tax reform, but the Highland Council have stepped up against the SSEN's super pylon plan for the Spittal and Caithness to Beaulieu.
Caithness. Just if you're ever there, it's a real giveaway for everyone who says Caithness, so for whatever reason, it's Caithness, but still, so it's just to improve your credibility with all those people with their tacking stitches in and everything, in case you counter one fifth or so.
I try your faith.
But anyway, now I'm just trying to find who sent this in to me, but yes, it was the Highland Council who've got a nexus in all of this, but have generally speaking, either batted proposals through. And just to remind you, 1,300 applications existing or on the go for wind farm related stuff, much of which will not find its way into the grid because about 40% of it is already constrained, so it doesn't reach the grid. And we pay the existing wind developers not to produce. So, the super pylon that's meant to go from Spittal and Caithness to Beaulieu, Highland Council has lodged a comprehensive objection with Scottish Government ministers. And it's, there's some kind of fairly fruity language and kind of, it's a really wholehearted kind of opposition, which I don't think anyone expected. So that does sort of now throw another ball into the Scottish Government's court, because at the moment they're saying it's the Electricity Act, it's reserved to Westminster, we are mere playthings in this world regarding to that, legally, there's the lawyers again, and we just have to nod this stuff through as planners. Well, do you? And what point democracy if you've got this council, which is, I mean, there's most times I would be giving Highland Council pelters for being practically the largest council on earth, right? But nonetheless, it represents a wheen of folk, and it has decided to make this stand. So what will the Scottish Government do, I wonder?
Well, I think we watched this space, but it was very interesting to see how kind of beastie this was. It's described by the Courier as a devastating 8-page objection that completely eviscerates the super pylon plan. So, we'll watch this space. But
I should just say as well that, I mean, the film is being shown in Bewley on the 29th of November. There's people getting in touch from all over the place, from Tainault, for example, who want to show the film there, from people in the borders. I'm going to forget everywhere, Perthshire, a different bit of Perthshire. And I keep saying to everybody, there's only me sitting here, right? I mean, there's no great backup or anything. I can't be your campaign. You need to be your campaign. And actually, you guys need to talk to one another. And this is a toughie. I mean, it's been tough for the guys in the Highlands to break out and, deal with one another rather than just their own kind of glen. But if you want to get somewhere, if you look at how much of Scotland is now fairly up in arms about this situation, you need to make common cause with one another, because you will keep sinking and swimming individually otherwise. I mean, when I've got enough time, I will sit and fire off a collection of everyone's emails in a sort of, way that doesn't breach blimmin' health and safety or whatever the thing it is, to you, so that you can just somebody decide to take a deep breath and talk to one another, I would suggest, quickly, because this stuff is happening, as you all know, this is happening now. Actually, just while we're at it, I got an email. This is just going to encourage people sending more stuff in about complicated stories that are nonetheless quite interesting. So just don't do it, right? But anyway, but anyway, Ed Coulson, who I think is still living in Ireland, but anyway, sent something in about the new consultation in Edinburgh about a new north-south tram extension. He's very worried, and another pal of mine has got exercised about this, because it looks like the preferred route is going across the much-loved Roseburn Path, which is a traffic-free linear park and basically lets you walk and cycle and everything, irreplaceable habitat for corridor for wildlife. And this apparently is better than it running along Orchard Brae, where it would also serve the Western General. So, he's saying, look, this is bonkers, but he's also passed on a link written by a Paddy Fletcher, I'll put this in the notes, who's co-founder of the Port of Leith Distillery. By gum, has this guy done his maths, to the degree that I am simply going to repeat some of the statistics here. Haven't had the time to sit and do the maths. But what he's finding basically is the new tram line proposal that would start from Granton in the north and run to the Royal Infirmary, or Shawfair, which is a new big housing development. It's not quite clear. But anyway, the cost is projected to be 2.9 billion over 7 years. He points out that Edinburgh Council's budget for all capital projects, that's schools, housing, culture, fixing RAC, transport, all of it, right, is 1.3 billion. 2.9 billion for that one tram line, 1.3 billion for everything else. He's saying Edinburgh Airport could be bought for less than the cost of the tram, with 400 million to spend on improvements. You might not think that's a very green thing to do. Or you could build 5 royal infirmaries in Granton, so you wouldn't need to go north. Cost you a bit more to get all the staff in, right enough. But his main point is that the fares on the tram will cost more than the bus, and it will take longer to get there. So, just by the by, the tram will be going over Northbridge, I think, and Northbridge would need substantial strengthening.
Well, I think we hope to goodness that Northbridge, after having however many tens of millions, is being strengthened to take the tram. I don't know whether you just pray that has actually happened, because that's taken a decade or so to fix.
Jeez. So anyway, well, in that case, it looks like they're just locked and loaded and sort of intent on spending that money. But it's also, the money has been funded by a massive grant. I mean, the argument from the council is that the tram will be funded by debt against future ticket income. And I don't know how the current tram's washing its face, but they might be rather. Other cities got people flying around on trams. But that, I just wonder sometimes if, having been, for example, in Helsinki, there's a kind of critical mass needed of trams before you are using them a lot. I obviously don't live in Edinburgh, so I'm probably representative of nothing. But I think I've used the tram once because I basically am still on the bus in my head, and because I duke from bus to bus. People that have got proper tram networks duke from tram to tram because there's a lot of them, So fact kens, there might be people who go, no, the tram is the future for the city and it was a disaster that it ever got pulled up. But now that we're here, the amount of money going into that, anyway, the consultation ends on November the 17th. So have a look, folks. And if you want to say something either way, do it.
Yeah, well, we'll put the link up to that. I mean, the problem with the Roseburn Path is, of course, it is a rail line that's been created into a cycle track. So it is, looks pretty good for sticking a railway track in because that's what it was designed for. But of course, its use has adopted and changed since the railway was taken out, and it's now a very kind of cherished part of the city. I think the Edinburgh Trams project are hoping that you should be able to do both, that the tram and walkers can be, and cyclists can all kind of use that track, and it's certainly much less expensive than taking it over the other bridge and running it over the road with all of the traffic impact that would have. So I'm not sure I'm convinced one way or the other about the Roseburn Path. It does make absolute sense to have a tram line running down what is effectively the rail corridor. It's just that in the last sort of 30, 40 years, the rail corridor has become a cycle corridor, and they need to make sure that that can also be accommodated. So yeah, it's a contentious thing, and we'll stick up some links to that.
In case we run out of time, because at the meeting that I'm here for is kind of looming somewhat. The one thing I just really wanted to make sure I said something about was Elspeth King. Because she died last week suddenly, and she was an amazing woman, and it vexes me enormously. Like so many big champions of Scottish culture, a lot of people will be thinking, who's that? I'm just writing a column for the National, so there'll be a bit more about it. But there's another excellent piece that was done strangely by STV, an STV reporter, a really good written piece about an interview. And this was Elspeth basically breached into the People's Palace, which I hadn't realised opened in Glasgow Green in 1898. I mean, that old. And it was intended for the masses to, be educated and so on. It kind of was struggling a wee bit. Elspeth worked as a curator between 1974 and 1990 and fairly zinged the place up. She was the one, of course, this is the only thing that is running in the obituaries and so on to her. She put Billy Connolly's banana boots in, bought them, I think he donated them actually. And that became a kind of real focus. I can remember getting wheeled around to see the banana boots, even though my mum disapproved of Billy Connolly because he swore. And that would be about the same, when at the point when those boots were put in, Billy Connolly had just done his famous crucifixion routine, which imagined Jesus' Last Supper taking place at the Sarryhead pub in Glasgow.
At the Gallowgate rather than Galilee.
Yes, which was so controversial that Pastor Jack Glass was outside she says the venue, but I don't know whether that was the museum or the Sarryhead, accusing Billy Connolly of blasphemy. I imagine it's her museum, and trying to shut it down. So, it was very controversial, but it was a real crowd pleaser, which of course is what makes everybody, then she gets the populist tag. But the point was that so many parts of working people's heritage had just been completely lost in the period when all the tenements were bulldozed, when everything was kind of modernised in Glasgow and across Scotland, but very particularly Glasgow. So she ended up scouring the barrows for basically artefacts from the stalls. So a lot of the stuff that appeared in the People's Palace came from the barrows. So, I mean, for example, her colleague then became husband, Michael Donnelly, another great guy for picking this stuff up. Apparently, his most prized find was a stone-framed tramp card, which was a stonemason's. And apparently, trade unions gave these to blacklisted workers to help them find work and a place to stay with fellow members in a new city. Who knew, right? A tramp card. So that's a really, really important thing for a city that was a pioneer in all sorts of left-wing people's workers' organisation, a lot of which archive-wise has just been completely lost. And so, I mean, she was quite explicit in saying that her curation efforts were diametrically opposite to William Burrell and the Burrell collection. This is not, dealers sending stuff expensively all over the world. She said, what we were our colleagues called us midden rakers. And she said the only reason they got away with it was because they weren't the Kelvin Grove. So the People's Palace was kind of slightly, allowed to do stuff like that. And the other thing to say is how impressive it was about how quickly she moved on something. Everybody else would feel they had to wait for decades to pass before they were sure that something happening was going to be important enough to become history. Whereas there was a miners' rally and march from Fife to Glasgow Green in 1985. And she said that they had basically bought one of the banners on the march and it was up in the People's Palace before the march had reached Glasgow Green. So, I mean, the amount of flack she took, I knew her through Harpies and Quines. She did so much stuff on suffragette history, which up until then, people just thought had really happened down the road and not in Scotland. She put all of that back on the map. There's so many achievements, I can't list it all here. But she just had a constant battle with the forces of grim convention. She didn't get the promotion she should have got. She nonetheless just accepted that and moved around the country, really renovating and restoring Abbott's house in Dunfermline and giving a new heart to the city there, and then running the Smith Gallery in Stirling for many years. But she was brilliant, and it's a shame. It's a terrible shame. And I just hope that people mark her passing because she was a huge person in our story.
Just a fantastic individual, and to have that kind of zeal and not be put off by your colleagues kind of poo-pooing you and just going forward and taking on that mission to document the people's history of Glasgow in the way that the People's Palace is supposed to be. It was just quite an incredible life mission. I've got a Pastor Jack Glass pamphlet I'm quite proud of. Because he was still at it, Jack Glass. I remember even when Pamela Connolly was bringing out her biographies of Billy Connolly, 10, 20 years ago, he was still protesting the book signing. So I've got the Crown of Thorns pamphlet somewhere, which I treasure. Spurned the famous phrase from Billy Connolly, Jack Glass is a pastor, which very good indeed. But yeah, we'll put a link up to her.
I need to run out the door now.
Yes,
My God,
go.
I've just noticed the time.
Right, so we'll put a link up to her bio, and on that garbled and rushed ending, we will see you next week, folks.